Hello everyone, it's time to Nephis and chill. There will be two purposes to this video. The first purpose is for those who may be bored by the content of this video. This could serve as potential ASMR as I read 3 different articles of the same series where we read about how the ESO developers pretty much have this philosophy or design philosophy in regards to how they design and balance PvE content. I think this is very insightful. So that's the second purpose of this video, if you're not going to use this as some sort of sleeping aid. But yeah, the second purpose of this video is to kind of see and peer into the mind of the devs, and I'll probably try to share some insights, if I have any, while we read over this in regards to like what I think and how they could potentially take into account some other things if they've missed any. I have not read these yet, so this is kind of going to be on-the-fly reaction. So yeah, let's get to it. ESO Developer Deep Dive, Designing Tamriel's Bosses, Part 1. Alright, so they brought in lead encounter designer Mike Finnegan and senior content designer, who I've never heard of, Shane Slama. I hope I pronounced that right, to share their process and knowledge surrounding the design and creation of a dungeon or trial boss in ESO. So they'll dive into the team's philosophies and core design elements. Alright. So, is there a core philosophy that drives the design of a dungeon or trial boss? Mike enthusiastically says yes. We have a few core tenets that we always try to follow when designing a new boss. One important one is that we always try to reinforce the standout elements of ESO's gameplay. For example, movement is key, and you shouldn't have a boss standing still while the team simply whacks away at them. You want to get players moving around, and whenever possible, lean into things like interrupts, blocking, and dodge rolling. Okay, this is... I don't know if he's like... I feel like half of the bosses in ESO just stand still. I don't know. Is it just me, or like, what's going on? I mean, like, things like Yonakrin, Locustes, I guess, like, some elements of the fight where you're not whacking them, you do move around. I mean, there's so many dungeon fights where I feel like you just kind of are standing there. Of course, like, I think it's highly dependent on groups too for some fights, but I feel like a large majority of the ESO fights for bosses you can afford to kind of stand around now. But I mean, it's kind of interesting that that's their perspective, you know. So this is pretty cool. And Shane Slama says, I think another tenet I'd include would be related to story and setting. Okay, we want to make sure these monsters and bosses tell the story that we're looking to tell and fit into the overall adventure. And Mike says, yeah, it all starts with the story we're telling in the dungeon, and everything leans into that, including what specific bosses we're going to design and how they fight. And the question here is, what elements of a dungeon or trial boss does the individual designer generally develop? Okay, so Shane says, we designed the abilities suite that the monster uses, but also the way the monster interacts with the environment. This can include how it moves around the space, or whether there's other environmental elements it can pick up or go to or move around. Mike also remarks on the space, even the space itself. Designer will work with a world builder. Oh, that's pretty cool. To craft a space to fit the boss design too. We like to say we're not building bosses, we're building encounters. It's the totality of the environment they're in and all the other elements that are going to be part of that scene. Yeah, I can see that. I mean, especially Rockaroo, I think a lot of the fights were definitely thematic and had a lot of elements tied in with what the fight was about. I mean, Zalvaka, I mean, that's just straight up like, okay, her environment is what? Lava and the spires, so that's pretty cool, okay. Shane says, right, we're building an experience. The boss should inhabit the space, and the space should inhabit the boss. That's some deep shit right here. I mean, it's some joints. They should kind of meld together if done correctly. Okay. When you walk into a space, we'd also like to introduce elements of the fight. They can be super memorable and can be really set the tone for the battle location and the setting matters. For example, at the top of the white gold tower, after it explodes, there's lightning all around that turns into a hazard, and during the fight, the boss actively uses that against you. Okay. It's really the whole thing we're designing. It's the level environment. It's what the boss does and what other monsters are a part of it. Sometimes it's all about what we give players access to. What should we introduce to the player that's unique? Can the players use the environment to their advantage? That all plays into it. And now this person is asking, could you run us through the step-by-step process for the creation of a boss? Okay, so Mike summarizes it as, you know, figuring out what monster or character you're going to use. And then it seems like they get that idea from zone or dungeon design documents, which I'm going to assume comes from a different team. And they also want to build bosses that integrate well into the story. From that point, we pass it on to the designer. Shane, I think, picks it up here where he says, once we have a design document that outlines the dungeon and a suggested monster, the designer can either go forward with that monster or say, hey, I have a different idea and I want to go into this direction, and potentially use a different monster so long as it's still servicing the story. Mike agrees with him. Yeah, as far as how each individual designer approaches a specific boss once the story elements are worked out is going to vary. One designer might prefer you give them the full background of the character to inform them how they make the abilities, whereas another might believe that a particular mechanic is fun and start there, adding the story flavor later. So how designer approaches a specific boss up to them. So okay, so that's pretty cool. So you can start with either the aesthetic or you can start with the mechanics. Okay, I can see that. At that point, Shane says they build out the abilities and craft the encounter design document. Lots of documents here. Kind of like a peek behind game development. They then put it in front of different teams, specifically animation, oh my god, visual effects and audio. Oh, this makes sense. And they tell the designer how much the encounter is going to cost, and together they adjust from there. Once they have a pretty good idea from the production side regarding what they're able to deliver, the designer moves ahead to building out a prototype. They then get an early playtest of it and start fine-tuning. This sounds really complicated. During this process, the boss designer is working with both the writer and content designer to make sure the boss fits into the dungeon storytelling questline. Okay, eventually they get a good feeling as to whether what they're gonna have is gonna work or not, and the foundation is set, and then they keep going. There's also playtesting all the way through, and a lot of QA as the designer continues to iterate and makes it ready for a balance pass. Finally, the designer goes into bug fixing mode, starts cleaning it up, and prepares the boss to hit the public test server and cycle. Interesting. How important is collaboration during this process? I mean, this is, come on. They could have probably asked a better question here. I mean, they just mentioned like 6 different departments. I hope collaboration is important during this process. But yeah, let's move on to part 2. Okay, so part 2. This is going to be talking more about boss design. Where does the dev look for inspiration when designing a boss's abilities and mechanics? Okay, this is actually a pretty interesting one, because when I was playing Destiny and stuff like that, I was like, man, some of the stuff in Destiny seems really familiar. And it turns out, I found out that a fair amount of Destiny developers, or Destiny 2 developers, used to work at ZOS. And I was like, I realized that the game development industry was so small. Like, everyone basically knows each other. So when I thought about that, I was like, man, okay. So every time I look around now, it's like, oh, did those people get the inspiration from this? And that's always what I'm looking for sometimes when I look at a trial. But yeah, here, Shane says, we generally attack that from a couple of different angles. Something our designers do first is figure out what the boss is all about. What's their background? What's their story? What kind of monster is it? Okay, fair enough. And they go through the catalog of stuff they've already done and see how this type of monster was presented previously. But they also want to introduce unique stuff. But we also, although we don't want those unique things to be something that's totally divorced from the identity of that monster type. Yeah, that'd be funny if, like, I don't know, a Nereid was shooting out, Sith lightning. What kind of challenges does a designer encounter when working on a new boss? It can be enticing to focus too much on the mechanics themselves instead of trying to take a holistic approach by using the storytelling. We can design all kinds of crazy and cool abilities, but if the designer gets too hung up on individual mechanics, that can be a trap. Huh, okay. The best way for the combat to play out, I think, is by continuing to tell the story that's already started. And anytime we get hung up trying to think about what this boss is going to do, we need to take a step back to think about the encounter's background, the storytelling, and characters. And Mike chimes in here saying, we go through that a lot in review and iteration. Somebody will put this mechanic together and will play it, but then think, okay, well, we got the one thing and that works, but there's got to be other aspects of the fight. It's very much a layered approach where we say, you've got that one cool big mechanic, but what else is going to happen? We're not building a fight for one moment. Okay. Alright, this is a really interesting question. Do you design a new boss with the core rules in mind? DPS, tanks, and heals? Well, okay. Before I read the answer, I'm like thinking to myself, it's pretty imbalanced if they're thinking about DPS, tanks, and heals. Like, sometimes the tanks have to do too much. Sometimes the DPS doesn't do anything. Sometimes there's like no need for a healer, right? But I think with the recent DLC dungeons they've been introducing since like update 29 or update 30, it's been fairly more balanced towards needing healers again, in my opinion, for most groups now. So, yeah, it's pretty good to see. Alright, so Mike says, yes, we do keep those in mind. We're thinking about those roles as we design and as we get feedback. When we go into playtests, we have people that are playing healers, DPS, and tanks, and we're getting feedback from them specific to their role. We'll ask the healer, did you feel challenged in this fight? Did you feel that you're a worthwhile member of this group? Or for the tank, we'll ask, did you ever feel threatened? And stuff like that. Oh, okay, that's cool. We absolutely keep an eye on all those roles as we're designing and testing these bosses to make sure that people are adequately challenged based on their role. And Shane here puts, I think that when we do that well, it creates that connection between players. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's really important in my opinion. And a sense that somebody is needed in their role. This is really nice. I love that Shane said this. I'm the healer. I'm here to keep you alive. You're here to make sure the baddies don't punch me in the face, and the damage dealers are here to take them out. Yep. Yeah. Okay. A feeling of synergizing together through the combat itself. It's nothing fancy, but getting that right and making sure those elements are there to challenge those roles makes the fight feel more cohesive. They can also, one thing they haven't mentioned here, again, overdoing it. I feel like if you say, for example, like if you design a fight or encounter in this case, as I say, where the healer says, yeah, I'm the healer and I'm here to keep you alive, but I'm doing too much of that. It kind of, again, goes back to like, why are some bosses designed in such a way where if a tank messes up, right, a lot, it leads to like an like an inevitable group wipe. There's like a lot of cases like this in Kyne's Aegis, Sunspire, and Rockgrove. And to me, it feels like sometimes they put too much stress on each role, and that kind of creates a discord in this relationship they're talking about between the players themselves, right? I mean, if you guys, I'm sure a lot of you guys have experienced it, right? Especially as a support role in some of the newer content where you feel too much pressure. So I think they need to kind of take that into consideration as well. How do you approach designing a boss with multiple difficulties in mind? Okay, the numbers are a big part for sure. You know, health damage, etc. And these days we have three tiers of difficulty. What? So numbers are a big part when we go into balance and we're tuning those things. Okay, attention economy. I like that. How many plates are we asking players to spin? Where can we fine tune so that it leads to new challenges and new abilities being introduced at the highest difficulties? Attention economy, that's a good one. We also want to make sure that the most unique features of a boss encounter are experienced by everybody. Well, this is the problem here, right? Like, what do they mean by everybody? I think they mean like a majority. They shouldn't say everybody, because there's a lot of boss fights where I feel we've kind of like robbed these people designing the boss fights, because like there are really cool, beautiful mechanics that we never get to see because they just die so fast, even on the hard mode or even on like veteran. So yeah, the more mechanics we can expose to players to when playing on normal mode difficulty, the greater the feeling of progression later. See, again, this is a problem here because you're not exposing players to more mechanics on normal. Or maybe I'm like really like out of touch too. So I'll acknowledge that. Maybe I am out of touch with a lot of the player base. But I don't see this. And I feel like a lot of players who come to me don't see this as well. You know, so this is a very interesting thing they said here, and I enjoy that they said it. I think this could definitely open up more discussion in the future. They see how a boss fight is gonna work on normal, and then work their way up the difficulty tiers if they want to. Because they've had exposure to these abilities early, the boss isn't throwing all sorts of new stuff at them as they climb. Oh, well, I hope they explain like the jump between vet, normal, and vet hard mode. If you really want to challenge our best players in the hard mode, it can't just be a numbers game. The fact that the boss hits harder or has more health is part of it, yeah, but we also like to add a unique challenge that throws the extra plate in there, and sometimes two, to see if they can manage everything that's going on. Okay. Is it deliberate that in dungeons or trials early, bosses are less complicated than end boss? Oh, this is a good question. To an extent. Well, this isn't... So it's kind of weird, and I hope they answer this. To an extent, ideally, we do want to see somewhat of a progression where the first boss is maybe a little less complicated The second adds another layer, and the third or final boss is where the craziest stuff happens. I feel like that's sometimes not the case. Like Rockgrove, I feel like Zavaka is a lot more straightforward than Basse and Oxidsil. For sure. Like I find Zavaka to be the easiest boss fight in Rockgrove, even on the hard mode compared to the other hard modes, for sure, in my opinion. But yeah, I mean, I'll accept the answer too. And we budget the dungeon trials for that too. Mike chimes in. So generally, the final boss is going to have more art resources dedicated to account for its added complexity. Okay, yeah, I can see that. Alright, so the last part. This is the last part. The final part of our series. When designing a new boss, how do you balance complex mechanics and power? Oh, this is a really good question. We have some basic starting points like for numbers, depending on what type of attack it is. For instance, we have some ideas on how hard we want blockable attacks to hit. So we plug in those numbers early. Okay. As far as the more complex or unique abilities go, they're balanced via iterative playtests. It's just keep testing it over and over. It's funny because one designer's bosses might hit you way too hard right out of the gate, whereas another designer is the opposite and their attacks are going to barely tickle you. Fixing all that comes from playtesting and fine-tuning. Okay. There's also a question around how many possible things can be hit with at once, or whether an attack is going to hit different targets in the team. In other words, if the designer wants an ability to threaten the tank, it's going to one-shot everybody else in the party, so they can't often make it an area of effect attack. Well, yeah. Well, okay. But if they wanted to threaten the damage dealer, it's probably not going to do anything to the tank. Okay. Okay, this is complicated. Okay. Those are kinds of things that we think about when balancing mechanics and power. It's about knowing the target audience for the abilities you're making. And Shane chimes in here, yeah, and as we're playing these encounters, we'll often identify an ability that needs more work and clear the runway for it. If you got a big ability that's important, we want to highlight it. So we're going to tune the fight and say, okay, let's cut this out for now and just focus on this one important mechanic. And when that moment is over and we're done tuning, we resume working on the rest. Okay, so they're describing the process here. Talk to me about the role that QA plays. When do they come in and how do they help you improve the boss? I feel that someone's going to comment down in the YouTube section, what QA? But anyway, Shane says, we would be nowhere without them, that's for sure. Yeah, okay. Yeah, Mike says, yep, they're integral, critical, and we try to have them get in and test builds of the encounters early in the process so they can help us go down the right path. They're very highly trained players. Oh, and know their stuff, so they give excellent feedback. I wonder, I'm really curious actually. Like, I wonder, I don't know if anyone else is curious about this. I wonder how, like, good they are. You know what I mean? Like, I'm kind of curious now. Like, can they push world records? Can they, like, burn things like players can? Like, the best teams in the world can? Am I, like, in the... you know what I mean? Like, I'm so curious. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that'd be cool if we could, like, race against them or something, you know? But even mid-cycle, when they get in there and start testing with an eye on bugs and other problems, it's monumentally important to the integrity of the fight. They make sure there's no exploits, and they're a big part of the balance work. They also help to make sure the numbers are right, and that the abilities are firing at an appropriate time. Plus, they call out all sorts of moments that we would see as problematic, or where there's weird overlaps with certain abilities. Bugs are a big part of it for sure, but they're the first players, other than the design team itself, to see the encounter, and they're giving us feedback from the player's perspective. It's integral to the process for sure. So again, I'm really curious what their skill level is. Not like as a way of like, you know, like insulting them or anything, but I'm just genuinely curious. Like, how good are they? Because, damn, you know. Mike Finnegan says, oftentimes they're seeing this content in about the roughest state it can be, but they're so used to sitting down going through stuff with us that they can see past the rough edges and give us feedback on the actual mechanics. But I mean, going back to this, like, I like how I keep going back to this, like, what if there were, like, teams of QA players, or QA testers, or QA staff? What if they could also push world records? Or, like, what if they could also, like, raid? You know what I mean? Or you know what I mean? That'd be cool. Or maybe, yeah, I don't know, I'll love to see that shit, personally. And Shane says, yeah, and much like we were saying earlier, when we reach out to the various teams, we get all sorts of cool ideas from them. There's lots of stuff in the game that only made it into the game due to a QA suggestion. That's pretty cool. We could be deep into the process and getting close to the end and wrapping this content. It could throw a cool idea that could result in a major shift. How does the PTS cycle help refine or improve a boss? I'm so curious about what this is going to say. Mike says, while our QA group is fantastic, and this is going to sound like a bizarre statement, they're almost too good. A lot of time we won't see stuff that's too hard, or because we're all really close to it, we might think that mechanic is messaged correctly when it's not. We won't know for sure until the public sees it, and then we realize that something didn't hit quite the note that we wanted to, or is more difficult than we had intended, or something like that. While QA is finding a lot of stuff early, the minute a boss hits PTS, we're going to find a whole slew of new things to fix that we just hadn't seen before. It's just got more eyes on it, right? The more perspectives we get on a boss, the better. Okay. I think the rise of streaming has helped a ton too. I don't know how developers made a game 15 years ago without it. It's such an important tool for us when the boss hits PTS. We see things differently because we're so close to it. Are they picking up on the mechanics? How did they figure something out? Maybe they see something in a certain way we can't. So I'm gonna, so the whole misform thing from Rock I gotta bring this up. I gotta bring this up, alright? We gave feedback about the misform for Base hard mode in Rock Grove, and that led to a whole bunch of things. And I just feel like, again, this kind of goes back to, like, what's the skill level of the QA team? You know what I mean? Like, I'm thinking, like, these guys are so good that they didn't need misform and they got Planesbreaker. You know what I mean? So, you know, when I'm reading this, I'm like, okay, yeah, that's cool, but I feel like there are some times, if it doesn't, like, you know, I don't see it. I don't see some of this sometimes. You know, but again, maybe that's just me. Aside from bug fixes, do you continue to iterate on the boss after it is live? Once something gets live, we don't want to wholesale change it. We don't want players to come into encounter and say, oh, this is completely different. Well, again, Rock Groove. So 99% of the things that we're going to do in encounter after it's live will be tweaks to numbers and readability and mechanics and stuff like that. The fight isn't going to fundamentally change. We're going to either take the edge off or put the edge back on in some cases, although we generally try not to increase difficulty when something is live. Okay, fair enough. If an ability exploitable or something like that, we're going to fix it, but we generally try not to boost difficulty too much. Most of our changes are going to be after we get the data and realize the completion rate on the boss is low, and that we want to dig in to find out why and make tweaks. And that explains a lot, actually, to be honest, based on their past nerfs to past content. And Shane finishes off this. Honestly, I really enjoyed this deep dive. Gave me some clues and hints. Definitely. I still have some questions. But Shane concludes here, sometimes we get situations where a bug has come up on live that we have to be very careful with, because when we fix it, it's going to make the encounter harder in general. Huh, really? I'm trying to think of an instance where this has happened. A bug on live. Because when we fix it, it's going to make the encounter harder in general. I'm trying to genuinely think of something that was a bug. Maybe it's something that was never said in patch notes. That's why I'm coming up empty here. We might fix this bug, but we'll then also probably need to tone down something else. Something else down so that the difficulty stays where it was. Okay, I mean, again, I don't know what you guys think about this, but I had a really fun time reading this. I hope they do more of these, not just for the trials, but maybe or dungeons, but maybe also for like other things like sound and stuff like that, because I'm particularly interested in sound and stuff like that. But yeah, thanks for Nefes and chilling, and big thank you to Mike Finnegan and Shane Slama for this interview. See you guys next time. Stay safe and have fun.